advertisement and try to participate in those areas. Okay, enough on the commercial stuff. Martha, Tom, I hope I checked off everything. Let's turn to today, because today we are talking about the pandemic and inequality. Very important issue, and we have an illustrious panel to really discuss some of those issues. So I want to take a few minutes and go through very quickly their a short bio of each of them, and then I want to turn the floor over to them. So our first speaker will be our very own Professor Thomas Clevin, who is a professor of law at Texas Southern University, Thurgood Marshall School of Law in Houston. He's been there since, he's been a professor since 1980 after joining in 1974. He teaches property, local government, public education, and environmental law. His recent publications include a couple of books, one on education law, strategic policy, and sustainable development in Africa, published in 2018, and a second called Equitable Sharing, Distributing the Benefits and Detriments of Democratic Society, published in 2014. Our second speaker will be Alicia Yamin. Alicia, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Yeah, that's great. Great.
Okay, all righty, thank you. So Alicia is currently a senior fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School, and she's a senior advisor on human rights at the Partners in Health. Alicia is also a research leader of the Gender, Sexuality, and the Law unit at the Center on Law and Social Transformation, and a member of the Bergen Center on Ethics and Priority Setting. Both of those are in Bergen, Norway. Alicia is trained in both law and public health at Harvard, and her 30-year career looks at the intersection of global health and human rights, and she bridges both the academy and activism. Her recent book, her latest book, is entitled, and she's going to talk a little bit about that, When Misfortune Becomes Injustice, Evolving Human Rights Struggles for Health and Social Equity. And it came out, it's already out, it's published this year in 2020, right? Our third speaker will be Professor Erica Wilson. Erica is an associate professor at law and holds the Thomas Willis Lambert Distinguished Chair in Public Policy at the law school. Her research and teaching interests include clinical legal education, education law and policy, specifically including educational equality for disadvantaged students at the intersection of race and law. She teaches critical race theory, education law, and serves as the director for the clinical program at University of North Carolina. Is that correct? Her recent publications include one, Reverse Passing, published in the UCLA Law Review in 2017. A second publication entitled When Diversity Fails, Social Dominance Theory and the Persistence of Racial Inequality, published in 2017. Our fourth speaker, we have an abundance of riches, what can I say? Our fourth speaker is Professor Emeka, and let me see if I can pronounce this correct, Durigbo. Help me out, Emeka, please.
Close enough. It's good enough. Durigbo. Yeah, Durigbo.
Durigbo. Okay, yes, not so hard.
Yes.
Also a professor at Texas Southern University, Thurgood Marshall School of Law, and he's been there since about 2006. He teaches business associations and oil and gas law. He's a nationally and internationally recognized scholar and advocate with this focus on energy law, business law, and international economic law. Has a wealth of experience, both in practice and in the academy. And his recent publications include Nunc Dimittis, or Chief Cornerstone, Evaluating Africa's International Norm Development Experiment in the Chad-Cameroon Pipeline, Project, which came out in 2015. A second article, also on energy, is entitled Balancing Energy Development and Environmental Rights, from Foreign Litigation to International Insurance, and that was published in 2014. Our fifth speaker, Professor Spiller, is an expert in labor and employment law, and is the Edwin W. Hadley Professor of Law at Northeastern University School of Law. And from 2002, and I think most of us know this, know her, know Emily, from 2002 until 2012, she was the Dean of the School of Law. Emily focuses on the challenges faced by low-wage workers and ways in which workers may exercise voice, with an emphasis on issues of retaliation and whistleblowing. She has a particular interest and expertise in areas relating to workplace injuries and illnesses and the problems faced by injured workers. Again, a rich background, which I will post for some of you. We were chatting before the panel began, and she noted that if you've been around a while, you have quite an extensive resume, and as you might expect, she has a very rich resume. Our last speaker is Professor Andrew Hammond. He's an assistant professor of law, at the University of Florida. He teaches and writes in the areas of administrative law, civil procedure, legislation, and poverty law. His scholarship focuses on how agencies, courts, and legislatures respond to poor people's claims amid the structural challenges of poverty and inequality. I don't think I got your recent publications. I'll go back on that. Some recent work of his includes an article that's forthcoming entitled Americans Outside the Welfare State, and it's coming out in the Michigan Law Review. And a second article is entitled Litigating Welfare Rights, Medicaid, SNAP, and the Legacy of the New Property, published in Northwestern University Law Review in 2020. So with that, I hope I've done you all justice. It's really an illustrious panel. And at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over and let you hear from this distinguished group. So Tom, why don't you lead us off?
Okay, I wrote a piece called An Overview of Where We Stand by way of an introduction to the workshop to try to put the coronavirus in context of what's happening in our world today, and as an introduction to the more specific presentations that follow. I see the coronavirus as related to a range of other crises or potential crises confronting humanity. The despoliation of the environment, immense inequality in wealth and well-being, a rigidifying class structure, loss of faith in democracy and burgeoning fascism, the persistence of racism and sexism, the risk of nuclear war. It is not a coincidence that all these things are happening at the same time, or that the coronavirus has come along at this particular moment. Personally, I think the pandemic portends a bleak future if humanity doesn't move fast to care for the environment, dramatically reduce inequality, and prevent the current fascist drift. I see the threats we face as an outgrowth of the spread of capitalism over the past several hundred years, of the impact that the values underlying and produced by capitalism have on how we think and organize social life. Ultimately, the purpose of any economic/political system is, or should be, to sustain human life and contribute to the pursuit of happiness. The core value underlying capitalism, its driving force, is competition for profit. Profit is good, it is said, because it signals the public's desire for the goods that produce profit. Competition for profit is good, it is said, because it improves the quality and lowers the cost of the goods people desire. And a strong case can be made that capitalism has in some ways, and for some people, made life better. Increased longevity, improved health, a greater variety of life experiences, not to mention indoor toilets, are all byproducts of technological development spurred by the pursuit of profit. Even the growth of democracy, as imperfect as it is over the past few hundred years, is interrelated with the growth of capitalism. But competition for profit has its downsides. The promotion of materialism and acquisitiveness so as to encourage people to want ever more things that can be sold for profit. Conflicts over access to the resources necessary to secure profit. The exploitation of workers so as to lower the cost of production and enhance the bottom line. The accumulation of money and power and the promotion of divisions within society so as to preserve one's gains, best one's competitors, and forestall challenges to the existing order. These downsides are the root cause of the many abominations that have accompanied capitalism's development. The decimation of indigenous societies, slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and of the threats we face today. Have the benefits of capitalism outweighed its downsides up until now? Critiques of capitalism extend back to its beginning, and throughout its history, many have predicted its demise or called for its elimination and replacement with alternative modes of production. But capitalism has managed to survive, in large part through its relentless expansion throughout the world, to the point that it is by far the world's dominant mode of production. Whether capitalism's current dominance indicates that on balance it has been positive, or rather that its proponents have been able to use the power they have accumulated to sustain it despite its enormous downsides, may be debatable. But whichever is the case, I would contend that the threats facing us now require that we move beyond competition for profit as the driving force of our economies and toward a sustainable development which recognizes that we are all interdependent and that there are limits to growth, and which distributes what we are able to produce and the power to decide what we should produce more evenly and more equitably. Without this move, it seems likely, as the better off in the world strive to stay ahead while the less well off strive to catch up, that we will continue to ravage the environment and engage in conflict over access to scarce resources, and that the world will become a less and less desirable place for most everyone. I believe humanity is capable of building a world that is sustainable and benefits all. The risk we face is that the individual self-interest of those who value ever more wealth and power for themselves may overwhelm the collective action necessary to address the threats we face. Here I see two major obstacles. First is the tendency of many humans to think short-term as we face potential disasters that may be difficult or impossible to prevent when conditions get bad enough to stir people to action. Second is the reluctance of the world's better off, the largely white haves, who make up a fairly small percentage of the world's population, to give up their privileged status and recognize that a world worth living in is going to require not only dramatically less inequality, but likely as well a less materialistic and more modest lifestyle. Overcoming these obstacles requires political action. This workshop and the work we all do in our professional and personal lives contribute to that end. So especially do the many movements that have sprung up in recent years. Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Move On, the Poor People's Campaign, and others. All these movements understand the interconnectedness of all struggles for social justice and the importance of grassroots mobilization and of working together to combat the power of those who benefit most from the existing state of affairs. The disruption that COVID-19 has brought and the unrest it and the country's resurgent racism have wrought signal a potential transitional moment. Whether and the extent to which we will be able to take advantage of it remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate it. Alicia?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Athena, and Tom, and everybody, all the organizers, for the invitation to participate in this workshop. I'm going to try to share my screen now to show a PowerPoint. Inviting me. Sorry about the technical difficulties. This is, let's see. this presentation is, as Athena said, based on a book that I wrote about sort of a self-evaluation, because I am a human rights lawyer, and I went to school around the time, the late 80s, early 90s, when both critical legal studies was very prominent, at least at the law school I went to, and also law and economics was emerging quite prominently, and human rights, and geopolitically there were tectonic shifts. Human rights seemed an opportunity to enlarge our imaginations. With a group of other colleagues and classmates, we founded a group on economic and social rights because we believe that human rights could potentially produce egalitarianism in the same way that it had facilitated democracy in other contexts. And the book is largely a kind of reflection on why it has not produced more egalitarianism in the world. So I have very little time, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. Let's see if there's, is this big enough for you to see?
Put it on slideshow if you can.
It is on slideshow. Damn it.
I can see it pretty well.
So can I.
Okay.
You might do it from the beginning, slideshow, play from the start.
Or play from current slide.
Or, okay. All righty.
Yeah, so this is the second slide. I apologize. But the questions that we were asking in human rights were, who's kept low on the social ladder, right? And those questions are still relevant today, as we see an epidemic of racial injustice in this country, as well as an epidemic of COVID-19. So, you know, we were always looking at, within the United States and also in other countries, why it is that certain populations, women, sexual minorities, racial minorities, persons with disability, people of scheduled castes, in whatever context, were kept low on the social ladder. And that's what these graphs look at here in the United States. And if you are not aware of it, even before this pandemic, there were really horrific disparities and inequalities in terms of health outcomes in this country. It's only because COVID has been so sweeping that we are all now aware of it. But before this, maternal mortality, for example, was 4 times as high among Black women and Latino women as it was among white women. The disparities in child mortality are as high now as they were before the Civil War. So there are enormous, enormous disparities based on race and ethnicity in health. And the health system, just as the criminal justice system, systematically excludes and marginalizes disproportionately young men of color. The health system, because of women's reproductive capacities and socially constructed roles in caretaking, disproportionately marginalizes and tells women that they are not full citizens in this society. But that is not unique to the United States. Health systems function that way across the world. So the questions we were not asking in human rights, and this is more to the point of this seminar, is how steep is that social ladder? And we have seen over these last decades how the social gradient gets steeper and steeper. And of course, that affects the people who are plastered down at the bottom. And that, again, is not something that is unique to the United States over these decades. And I'm not going to go back to hundreds of years of capitalism, but I am going to go back temporarily several decades to look at how we got to where we are. So post-World War II, human rights regime, UN, two different kinds of multilateralism in the post-World War II regime. One was the United Nations and human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and aspirations for equal dignity in all our diversity, for all the practical defects that that declaration had. But the other were the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and that was viewed just as critical to the peace and security of the world order. And those two different kinds of multilateral forms of governance have evolved and changed considerably since 1945. One thing that happened pretty quickly in the 60s and 70s was that there was a lot of decolonization. Obviously, in the United States, we still had de jure segregation when the Universal Declaration was promulgated. But one thing that happened pretty quickly was this separation between macroeconomic development, of how unequal between countries we allow the world to be, and human rights, which was about claims of people within countries. And that's, I'm going to whip through that, but there are a lot of political reasons for that. The second thing that happened pretty quickly after was the Cold War, and the idea that the only real rights were civil and political rights and not economic and social claims against government. And then there were a whole series of exclusions that women particularly face, because women face the violation and realization of their rights often in the private realm, and the reproductive justice movement has gone through that, in great detail. So in the 1980s, the period between 1945 and the early 70s was generally a time of growth and of reasonably, of hideous segregation and abuses around the world in terms of human rights, but of much less inequality than we are used to. So a CEO might earn 25 to 30 times as much as a low-paid worker, whereas now it's on the order of hundreds of times. But in the 1980s, that really began to change. Morning in America with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, and the embrace of neoliberalism, and the Washington Consensus. And that had a huge impact in the United States of America, but it also had a huge impact around the world in terms of what's called structural adjustment, and the recipe set out by what's called the Washington Consensus, targeting of programs instead of universal programs, relentless privatization, labor flexibilization that destroyed unions, trade liberalization, sort of a menu of reforms that, you know, before the IMF and the World Bank had kind of intervened sporadically in balance of payments problems, but these were really very intrusive reforms in the global South. There were also, as part of this privatization and neoliberal ideal, real contested understandings of health and health systems. So this whole, the spread of managed care in the United States, the idea that health systems should be run like marketplaces, that was not something that was universally thought earlier. There were contestations about religious and charitable organizations, about health systems as the culmination of workers' movements to create a different kind of citizenship. There were lots of different views of health and health systems, but in the 1980s, this marketplace view started taking over in a big way. And it had different effects because obviously in some parts of Europe, there was already more universal systems. And of course, in the 1980s, HIV happened, right? The pandemic that we should take lessons from. And a few of those lessons are, one, that social movements have a really ambivalent relationship with biomedicine, with pharma, and with that producing the great silver bullet magical solution, which it does not. And also stigma and discrimination issues that we are seeing wildly all over the place with COVID now, and the need, as Tom said, to act up, to take political movement and to mobilize. And I should note that today, right now, pretty much, Justice is Global is being launched, which is in part a right to health movement and part of Progressive International. So there are movements being launched, and my organization, Partners in Health, is part of that very much. So in the 1990s, you know, on the one hand, in human rights, we saw these social transformative constitutions. You may have be aware of what happened in South Africa after apartheid, a lot of post-dictatorship constitutionalism in Latin America. And there was a great hope in that kind of constitutionalism that you could have incremental changes through the rule of law instead of revolutions. But at the same time, in the 1990s, you have massive trade liberalization with incredible zeal, all these agreements, including NAFTA, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade becomes the WTO, which has biting enforcement power, which is really, really important for what happens afterward. There's a lot of financial deregulation. And intellectual property, WIPO, which was a UN agency, you know, is really swept up into the World Trade Organization, and this configuration of different kinds of law, copyright.
Alicia?
Oh, okay, I'll move along. Okay.
You know what, because your time is up. I don't know if you're seeing my messages.
Oh, I haven't been, Athena, but
I'm sorry.
I have 2 more minutes?
Just 2, you're way over. But
Okay,
thank you,
I'm
interesting
sorry.
stuff.
So I will skip a decade and just say inequality. By 2015, the top 1% of the world had as much wealth as the rest. And it's really bad, not just for health. If you think about, and I'm happy to answer questions about this, of why the countries that have most inequality are doing so badly in COVID, but it's also impossible to sustain democracy, the kinds of things that Tom talked about, the idea between the gap between those who make policy and those who have to live by that policy. Well, I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. And yes, I completely agree with Tom. We're facing a web of interrelated crises. But I do think that this is a time of radical upheaval. And we have a small window of opportunity to do something different. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry for going over and for the technical problems.
No problem. I am sorry. So one of the things about speaking, and I'm notorious for going over time, is that sometimes we're not paying attention to the chat. So I'm not so sure the chat is an effective way to let you all know what your time limit is or where you are. So I'll have to do it verbally. Do you mind? Okay. All righty. Erica, take us away.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here today. Thank you for coming out on a Saturday. I'm going to share my screen as well. Hopefully you can all see that. Can you all see it? Yes. All right. So the subjects of my remarks are about COVID-19 and racial disparities in education. As many of us know, there are rampant race and class-based disparities in public education as it stands now. And so COVID has made many of those things much, much worse and threatens to widen divides in ways that will deeply entrench race and class-based disparities in public education for a very long time. So what I want to talk about today is 3 things in the short time I have here. The first is I just want to talk about the way that our legal frameworks for distributing public education entrench educational inequalities. Also to the point Tom made, nowhere is it more evident the embrace of market-based principles in public education in terms of how we conceptualize the purposes of education and how we think about how it should be best delivered. I then want to talk about how COVID-19 exacerbates these inequalities. And then I want to close by talking about a few solutions that we might think about. So first, in terms of thinking about how our legal frameworks, the law structures educational inequalities, I'm going to point to two things. The first is the existence of school district boundary lines, the legal authority given to them. And second is the seminal Supreme Court case, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, which authorized private schooling. So on the school district boundary line points, I always like to start here because this is actually a map. The blue lines reflect all of the school districts in the United States, right? And so it's relevant because each of these districts has their own autonomy to deliver education, to tax, to pay for education, to the authority to exclude children from the boundary lines. And so you can see there are some trends here that towards the East Coast, Midwest, there are many more boundary lines. Headed west, a little bit less south, there are fewer boundary lines. But as you'll see in a minute, the boundary lines matter because they serve as barriers to effective distribution of public education across the country. And so I want to start by highlighting two cases that really gave teeth to the boundary lines and create many of the educational inequalities we see here today. The first is the seminal Milliken versus Bradley case. That is the case involving the school of Detroit, a school desegregation case where the court found that Detroit was segregated and the schools were segregated, and they were segregated due to actions on the part of the state. However, the court also overturned a district court's ruling that in order to desegregate the schools, that outerlying suburbs should be brought into the desegregation order. And so in doing so, the court noted that school district boundary lines have a certain importance and that they cannot be essentially moved for reasons related to this embrace of local control in public education. And so the other case, San Antonio versus Rodriguez, also held that class-based disparities between localities in terms of their ability to tax using local funding schemes to pay for public education meant that it was completely constitutional to have one school district be able to spend 10 times more than the neighboring school district, again, relying on this these notions about the autonomy that should be afforded to school districts, the importance of local control. So when I say the law entrenches inequality, we all know about Brown versus Board of Education, but we should also know about Milliken and Rodriguez because those two cases explain a lot about why our schools look the way they do, why it is that when I drop my niece off at school in Durham, North Carolina, it's 98% Black. Then I drive to work in Chapel Hill and it's like 3% Black and 80% white, and gross disparities all the way around. But we're all okay with that. We kind of just go along with it because that is, we ostensibly think, the way it has to be structured, but it doesn't have to be structured like that. So one of the things, the aftermath of Milliken and Rodriguez that we get from that as a matter of the law is that we know that school districts are essentially local governments, and that local governments are creatures of the state. The boundary lines are certainly creatures of the state, created by the state, yet the law treats them like quasi-sovereign, independent entities and is very reluctant to abrogate these boundary lines despite the existence of gross inequalities. And so what that essentially means, again, is that the various districts can tax and spend only for the benefit of the children who live within those districts, can offer wide curricular differentiation between districts. But for our purposes, the most important reality to live with, right, is that there's this connection between race, space, and place that enables these boundary lines and the autonomy given to them to effectively and lawfully enable racial exclusion and segregation. And so very similar, I'll go back really quickly to this picture, right? One of the underlying rationales for continuing to distribute public education in this manner is that the existence of all these boundary lines enables parents to quote unquote shop for a school, to find a locality or school that works best for them, very much like a marketplace rationale, and to allow different localities to decide to tax at a particular rate in order to have better schools, to enact zoning laws to attract a particular kind of family or person that will make their locality and school more attractive to certain people. But those principles definitely have race and class-based implications that allow boundary lines to be used in a way that enables exclusion. And so I wanted to especially focus on the exclusion because one of the really disturbing things that happens with these boundary lines is the way that the authority that school districts are given to police them, to make sure that residents don't improperly attend a school district that they don't live in. And so I just pulled this example. A really recent trend is the idea of school districts setting up tip lines where people can call and report someone they suspect of being illegally in the district. Some even go as far as to hire private investigators. And so what does that mean for the purposes of COVID? It means that we have a legal structure that's already set up when it comes to public education to individualize the distribution of education and leave it to parents to try and locate themselves in a locality that has an ample tax base and will be able to provide, quote unquote, a good public education. But what we see, going back specifically, to the Detroit example, right? We see that this effectively means that districts have gross disparities both in terms of racial composition and poverty rate. If you look at Detroit, they have a white enrollment that's only 10%, Grosse Pointe, a neighboring suburb, 83%, but the poverty rates are also very disparate. And so what that means in terms of how much they can spend per student is that the whiter district was able to spend almost $3,000 more per student than the predominantly Black Detroit school district. And so for purposes of COVID, what happens here is that you have already a gross disparities between districts, then COVID hits, and it really has put a magnifying glass on these inequalities. And so I pulled here an example from the Detroit and Grosse Pointe school systems of a student who lived in Grosse Pointe, didn't have a laptop, but then was able to get a laptop from the school because the school had the money to provide him with one, versus the student in Detroit who didn't have one and then was forced to borrow one from a youth group. So these kind of material differences between districts will manifest themselves even worse with COVID. In addition to district boundary lines, there's also the idea of private schools. Pierce versus Society of Sisters essentially said that it was constitutional for parents to send their children to private schools and that they could eschew public schools. What does that mean in terms of COVID? It's meant that those with financial and social capital who can afford to send their children to private schools are very differently situated than those who are in public schools. And so some of the things that we see from this map just shows all of the schools that have gone remote in the dark purple. But what it means is
did we get kicked off?
No, all of a sudden Erica is muted, but she's not on my end.
She's not. How did she muted herself?
Okay.
There you are.
All right. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. And wind up. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't
Yes.
hear you.
We can hear.
We can hear you.
We can hear you. We can hear.
Okay, you can hear me.
Mhm.
Okay, I can hear you now. I don't know what happened there. But I'll just conclude. I realize my time is up by saying that one of the things that COVID really has brought to light is the funding disparities, and some of the solutions that we need to think about are better federal and state funding sources, restructuring the way that we deliver public education, thinking about something I've written about, regionalism, instead of having school public education distributed on the local basis, doing it on a regional basis to ameliorate some of the race and class-based disparities, and remembering to focus on other social determinants as COVID hits and we have higher eviction rates, families without money. This will also certainly impact students' ability to learn and obtain a good education. So I'm happy to answer questions. Sorry I had to run through it so fast, but thank you.
I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Erica, I found your presentation very clear. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn the floor over to Emeka at this point. And so, Emeka, you're muted.
Sorry, I
We'll get better at.
All right, thank you very much. I am grateful to everyone for the invitation. And so I want to thank Professor Cleven for inviting me, and every other person. I've enjoyed the participation so far. I want to bring a perspective that is a little different. So this is my screen, which is talking about what is going on in Africa relative to the pandemic. I have some numbers here, some of which I will not dwell on in detail so that we can save time, but I kind of summarize them in some places. The abstract is pretty much the same one you have, so I'll skip it. But one of the first things I want to talk about is the puzzle that Africa has presented with regard to this pandemic. African countries are recording low rates of infection, low rates of death from this virus. Like you look at Ghana as of yesterday, 285 deaths. Kenya as of yesterday, 616. Nigeria, 1076. Egypt, 5,000. So you look at Nigeria cases, for instance, this is the most populous country in Africa. And the number of deaths since March till September is even lower than maybe the death rate from the US yesterday, I believe, but almost the same in one day. So that's quite different from projections going in. The understanding was that many people will be, on the streets in Africa, corpses everywhere, but that's not what's happening. And the experts are pleasantly puzzled. So like, what is going on here? So they now start coming up with certain explanations. So like, this is Nigeria's numbers. This is the largest country in Africa in terms of population, and it only has 56,000 confirmed cases, out of whom 40 something have discharged. They have about 10,000 active cases they are dealing with, and these are from all the country. They have about 36 states in Nigeria, and this is the total. Looking at the numbers yesterday from my home state of Imo State, they had like 5 cases, and this is a state with a population of millions. So that's kind of strange, and the people working in this area, the virologists, the pathologists, different epidemiologists and other, they are looking at these numbers from Africa and they're asking what is happening. So that's the mystery. So let's start with the mystery. It's like we thought we were heading toward a disaster, a complete murder, but that's not what we're seeing. And they're like, what is going on? So they come up with, so like the numbers you see, um, is just again, puzzle keeps on showing up. And one of the things happening is that they could actually see there are a lot of people that there's an indication they've had the symptom. They have the symptoms, they've had the exposure to the virus, but it's not, it didn't show up that they were sick or anything, and it doesn't show up in infections on other people that they're interacting with. So there's a huge gap between antibody data on the one hand and official case and death counts on the other. So a lot of people, so in Kenya, 1 in 20 Kenyans aged 15 to 64, that's about 1.6 million. They have antibodies to this virus, which indicates past infection. But when you look at the number of people infected, it's not anywhere close to that. And you look at the number of people dead, not anywhere. In fact, at the time they were doing this study, it was just like maybe 100 deaths. Yeah, 100 when the study ended. Okay, so that is some of the explanations they come up with is age. The average age in Africa is youthful. A number of people there are way below the age you have, like here in the United States. There are not many people, relatively speaking, that live beyond age 80 in Africa, and the consensus, I think, among this everybody working on this is that age plays a favorable role in surviving this virus. And then low testing capacity. They are looking at like these countries are not testing much. Like in Nigeria, initially I wasn't taking their numbers seriously because I knew they were not testing enough. They were just very few. Even today, they still test like maybe, a few thousands. And then it was like, okay, we just found 100 or 200 on that. It's not, people just don't even believe the numbers because they're not testing enough. On the other hand, though, you would think that many people will be dying whether you test or not. And people are not seeing that. They're not seeing relatives dying in any way different from what it was. They're not seeing people dying in a way you could not explain. If somebody had cancer, if somebody needed a lung transplant and couldn't get it and is dying and then dies, they could understand why. They were not linked, they don't link it to COVID in any way. So they're
5 minutes.
5, oh, great, okay. So different explanations, past exposure, like I said earlier, something genetics, and then lockdowns also, there was aggressive lockdown, but the one that is really the paradox is poverty. You would think that poorer communities will be in more danger from the virus, dying from it. But what I'm saying is that being poor is actually an advantage. This is one of the few times in life that poverty is actually seems to be an advantage. Like this scholar was saying here, savoring the irony of the possibility that Africa's entrenched poverty might for once work in the continent's favor. So because people are living in all these close quarters and getting exposed and surviving it, so they've developed this greater immunity over the years that it may be an explanation. Of course, nothing is done, the research continues. Now, that is like the health impact. What are the economic impacts of the virus in Africa? So the health statistics are encouraging, but the economics is bad. People are suffering a lot. I know personally, people losing their homes are about to lose it. Like rented places facing eviction, and people are really suffering, and businesses are affected. People that are self-employed can't, go to work because of lockdowns. People that had jobs are losing their jobs. Companies are closing. And so we have a different impact. What is happening is that the health impact is affecting the rich more, because these are the people that usually go abroad to get treatment for their health issues. And now with all this, no travel anywhere, bans on travel and all that, they couldn't, and then they started dying. There were also the people exposed because there were people traveling and coming back with the virus, or have friends and relatives that were traveling and bringing it. So the poor people and weren't as exposed, and we don't see much death from that community. However, the economic aspect, as I already said, is the poorer segments of the society. So what has government done? Government has responded, as in other parts of the world, with palliatives, but they are endemic. They are not a whole lot. I looked at numbers from Ghana. It was far more reasonable than bigger countries like, say, Nigeria. And but even at that, there are other complications. For instance, Nigeria has just decided to remove subsidies on fuel, petrol, gasoline, and electricity. And that is really okay. That's really a challenge. And then the healthcare infrastructure in these countries obviously are terrible. That's why the rich go abroad. And then corruption in administration of these public programs is also a challenge. I just singled out one of those, which is like Nigerian government awarding contracts for face masks, disposable face masks, procured at $50 each. I mean, that's outrageous. And so this is about the subsidies removed, and people are worried because petrol price is now almost double what it was about 5 years ago, and minimum wage hasn't increased as much. So there has also been private response. Individuals the companies have been giving money both to the government and directly to people to cushion the effects. And Africans living here, actually, but I mean like more recent immigrants like us, people have been able to step in and also some either provide expertise like the healthcare professionals, or in addition provide money to assist their relatives weather this. And also the African Development Bank decided to issue a huge bond program, $3 billion, to release money to governments and businesses to be able to get money to fight the impact of this virus. So the hope in Africa is that these infections will continue to stay low, deaths will stay low, because they don't have the resources to fight this. They don't have the resources to, they don't have the resources to fight this. People are not taking the virus seriously, to tell you the truth. You see videos of weddings and funerals, and people are just, they don't believe that much is happening. They're not wearing masks, they're not social distancing. They're like, yeah, this is just some scheme for the government to make money. They are stealing a lot of money. And there are some conspiracies. They don't know people that have died from this. They keep on asking, do you know anybody that died from this virus? Okay, I'm out of time. And then, so for the future, what I think is that to develop the healthcare infrastructure in these countries, the countries where these leaders run to for Medicare should think of banning that. But I'm not saying ban it immediately, because I mean, it could cause a whole lot of deaths, but give them some time to start working on the money they are stealing and sending abroad. Let them use it to start developing infrastructure there, so that at least they can save more lives, because now even they were the ones suffering because they couldn't go abroad. All right, okay. And then I also say that they should create a kind of fund that people from abroad here can contribute toward reviving the economies. So in conclusion, I think that we need solution contributions from different quarters to solve a problem that has been caused mainly by these politicians. So there's all these links I have here, and thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, and we can post that after suggestions, and we can kind of post a fuller description of our speakers, and list the books and articles that they are suggesting. Moving kind of quickly, I want to save some little time for questions, but Emily, take it away. Are you here?
I'm here.
Wonderful.
And
Yay.
while I'm going to my screen share, I want to say that what I've mostly been doing since the beginning of the pandemic is working with low-wage workers through organizations like NELP, the National Employment Law Project, and the Massachusetts Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health. So this is a different kind of, this presentation is much more concrete, I would say, than some of the presentations before me. So who are essential workers? The big groups are in food and agriculture, industrial, commercial, residential, and healthcare. 60% of essential workers are frontline workers who can't work from home. Now, some of these other people who work in the financial sector and stuff have the privilege of working as we do in almost relatively luxurious situations. But Blacks, Hispanics, other people of color, immigrants are way overrepresented among frontline workers. Over 41% of frontline workers are in a category other than white. Immigrants are way overrepresented in many of the low-wage jobs. And so they're working in low-wage jobs that require showing up and that lack paid sick leave and health insurance. You can see here that Black workers are much less likely to have paid sick leave and have the ability to work from home than white workers. On the other hand, I also think it's important that despite this disparity, large numbers of white workers also lack paid sick leave and can't work from home. And you all probably know this, but the Black and Indigenous Americans' experience with COVID is that they have the highest death rates from COVID-19. And much of that is associated with their work and the consequences of low wages. So lack of adequate protections at work, in urban areas, commuting on public transportation, being housed in crowded multi-generational housing, or farm workers in cramped housing, lack of health insurance and access to health care, and being told to come to work even if they're symptomatic, facing retaliation when failing to show up. And there's not time here to talk about the level of fear and the inadequacy of the retaliation. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office, faced with the fact that there was no one dealing with complaints that were coming in around health and safety, started to accept complaints. And they got 313 complaints from symptomatic employees who were told to come to work, an additional several hundred involving retaliation. So between a 9 and 10% of the complaint, and this is an informal complaint structure, this isn't OSHA, this isn't, about 10% of them involve this kind of retaliation or being afraid to go to work when symptomatic. So what was the governmental response? Well, all of the work-side organizations would say that OSHA is essentially missing in action. There's no permanent rule or standard that governs airborne infectious disease. OSHA refused to issue a temporary emergency standard. There was some discussion of doing one and forcing it through Congress, so that didn't go anywhere. And that, most of you probably don't know that much about the Occupational Safety and Health Act, but it has a provision in it that's called the General Duty Clause that requires employers to furnish workers with an employment which is free from recognized hazards. And in theory, that would be the mechanism by which OSHA would approach COVID situations. In April, OSHA said, well, we're essentially following the non-mandatory CDC guidelines, which I don't know if you're aware of this, but they say that sick people are supposed to stay home, but they don't say that exposed people are supposed to quarantine. And so the level of protection that was being offered at workplaces was pretty low. And OSHA said they would only enforce the general duty clause for very high-risk employers, that is healthcare, nursing homes, mortuaries, and not lots of places where other people were working. They did expand it to include workplaces with high numbers of complaints or known COVID cases. So they've received over 9,000 complaints regarding health and safety. 600 of those, more than 600, involve fatalities. So far, they've cited 6 workplaces, all of them in healthcare, except for the Smithfield food plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where I think a half dozen workers have died. Their proposed penalties in Georgia, it was about $6,500, $13,500 for the other workplaces. And those are the initial proposed penalties. They usually get negotiated down. A number of these workplaces have already indicated they intend to challenge the citations. And at the same time, the NLRB has issued multiple advice memos recommending against workers in COVID-related cases. They involve demands by unions to bargain midterm over COVID-related issues, retaliatory discharge issues where they found there wasn't any intent,
5 minutes.
protected concerted activity issues where they said, well, it was protected activity, but it wasn't concerted, where some nurses said they weren't going to work unless they were given proper protective equipment, and requests for information by unions. So in all of these cases, the NLRB advice memos have been against the workers. Workers' compensation, the primary reason I have this up here is not because of the nature of compensation, because we could have a whole separate conversation about the availability of compensation and sick leave pay and pay for time off for COVID. That's a complex area, and maybe Andrew's going to talk a little bit about it. I don't know. But what you need to know about workers' compensation is that it provides an incredibly broad liability shield for employers. And it also requires, in almost every situation, for workers to prove that their workplace was the cause of their illness. It's very difficult to do that in infectious disease situations, outside situations like nurses who were working in COVID floors. Some states have moved to develop presumptions of causation, but pretty much they're all rebuttable. We proposed a non-rebuttable presumption in Massachusetts, but it's stuck in the legislature. So people don't get it. So here's an example. The meatpacking industry employs about 500,000 workers. There have been 91 deaths as of early July, and many thousands of cases. 87% of the cases occurred among racial or ethnic minorities. Some of the plants actually voluntarily closed down initially because of how bad the outbreak was. And in response to that, Trump issued an executive order on delegating authority under the Defense Production Act, which was it was covered as requiring the plants to stay open, although in fact what it did was delegated it to the agriculture department to figure out what to do, and they never really issued a stay open order. But that was the federal government's response to what was happening in the meatpacking industry. OSHA literally just this week issued its first citation in the meatpacking industry, and there has been some response to do some fairly creative litigation that I'm going to mention in a minute as well involving this. So what's filling the gap? Governor's emergency orders. This is happening in Massachusetts. We just did Massachusetts just did a webinar on this for local public health officials. They're essentially assigning enforcement of workplace safety to underfunded local public health agencies who mostly don't know a thing about occupational safety and health.
2 minutes.
There are a few workplaces that have been shut down by local health officials temporarily while they got cleaned out. A few state OSHA plans are stepping up. California's begun issuing a bunch of citations. Virginia developed an infectious disease rule. Those states are states in which probably most of you don't know this, but about half the states enforce the federal law through approved state OSHA plans. And those Virginia and California among those. So some creative litigation by a number of firms. There's no money in this litigation, so that's it's labor firms and some public interest nonprofits that have been bringing these cases. McDonald's. I don't know if any of you've seen the use a dog diaper as a mask in the McDonald's in Oakland. So against McDonald's, the Amazon warehouse, meatpacking plants, there are some common law safety claims, and recently an emergency mandamus action against OSHA for leaving workers in imminent danger. Emergency mandamus actions in this situation almost never work. So, and there's organizing going on, not surprising, by unions in the most affected industries and by COSH groups around the country, and also by the Fight for 15, which is responsible for the McDonald's litigation. So
Time.
just a few takeaways. The class-race intersectionality is very clear here, and as I'm sitting right now in rural West Virginia, I feel that exceptionally strongly, that the failure of the state to act, particularly the federal government, but the states as well, is appalling, and that the key failures fall in health and safety at work, job security, income replacement, and health insurance protection. And finally, that when we talk about the effects of race and class, the race and class system in the US, we should and can be concrete, and the pandemic gives us a hell of a lot of examples to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. That was wonderful. Andrew? And I will, we're only gonna have a few minutes for questions, but I'll start taking a cue. You can let me know in the chat if you'd like to ask a question. Andrew, take it away, please.
Great, can everyone see my screen? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So thanks everyone for letting me participate. Thanks to Tom and Athena and to Denise for helping organize this and set this up. I'm really delighted to join you all. So I'm gonna talk about the pandemic as preview and in what ways it kind of highlights the American welfare state's weaknesses for the climate crisis. Since I'm by far the least distinguished scholar on this panel, I thought I would just kind of explain my research agenda and how I'm approaching this material. So I basically have two research agendas as a junior scholar. One is focused on civil procedure and economic inequality, and then the other half is really looking at the legal infrastructure of the American welfare state. So I really take PROWARA, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, also known as the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, as a way of thinking about basically the last 25 years of developments in social policy and poverty law. And so what I've written and what I have in mind in this line of inquiry is looking at the role of states, the ways in which the federal government has made it increasingly difficult to help or allow immigrant families to access public benefits, that actually Medicaid and SNAP have been surprisingly resilient in the Trump era. And part of that story is about fiscal federalism and the role of federal courts, despite those successes in many ways for the food stamp and Medicaid programs, and also supplemental security income, i.e. the means-tested disability benefit program. Americans who live in the territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, and the like, are left out of that welfare state. And that kind of brings me to my presentation today and the next project, which is really thinking about the law that we have really over the last 25 years. Are we ready for the climate crisis? That was the next paper I was planning on working on, and then the pandemic hit. And I was really interested in charting the federal government's response, especially with safety net programs. But I felt like despite my expertise in TANF and SNAP and WIC and Medicaid, there was so much going on that I needed to enlist the help of a couple friends and colleagues. So with Ariel Giroux-Kleiman, who teaches at San Diego, who's a tax scholar, and Gabriel Scheffler, who's a health law professor at Miami, we've written a paper that Minnesota Law Review's online companion will publish in November, looking at all of the government responses. And I'd encourage you to look at that paper. It's up on SSRN, and I really appreciate ClassCrits for circulating it. I think there are basically three versions of the COVID safety net story. So the first is the glass half full story. A lot of people have talked about cash payments. So these were the payments from the IRS. They've also talked about unemployment insurance, basically the $600 top up from the federal government. And then there's been less coverage about food assistance and medical assistance. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. That's gotten less attention in the press and by politicians, I think in part because the cash payments and the unemployment insurance was focused more on middle-class workers, and frankly, with the cash payments, even upper-class workers, whereas SNAP and Medicaid don't resonate in the same way for the media and political elites. But I think the glass half full story, it's important to keep in mind that both the CARES Act and the Families First Act increased significantly federal effort and federal spending as it relates to the food stamp program and Medicaid. So they created a pandemic electronic benefit transfer program. This basically was for all the kids who were losing meals because they weren't in school, and gave a credit, basically like a food stamp card, to all those families, including families that wouldn't qualify for SNAP. So families in the school districts that are community eligible, as I'm sure Erica knows. They also allowed states to make emergency SNAP allotments. So these are maximum grants, and the federal government's picking up the tab. And then they also blocked a proposed regulation from the Trump administration that had already been enjoined in federal court to deny SNAP to 750,000 Americans. So that was basically in the pipeline, and that's been stopped, at least for the next several months. Same with Medicaid. There were a lot of important changes, especially the increase in the federal commitment to the Medicaid program for state budgets, which is a huge deal. They also tried to work on online access for both SNAP and Medicaid, which is encouraging. The glass half empty story, though, is that these efforts on food assistance and medical assistance largely left immigrants and their citizen children out. The safety net programs are also not designed to assist people who do not have children, or more importantly, I should say, are custodial parents. So both the food stamp program and the Medicaid program, especially in states that haven't participated in the Affordable Care Act Medicaid expansion, millions of Americans are going to be left out of those initiatives. And then, of course, people who already did not have a job or weak attachment to the labor markets aren't going to be assisted by the unemployment insurance system. Then there are just a host of other issues. So, Congress did not increase the food stamp benefits in the way that they did with the ARA, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, the stimulus bill following the financial crisis. They also didn't increase the Medicaid spending in the way they did in 2009. The Trump administration declined to open enrollment for exchanges to get people health insurance who didn't. So we have millions of Americans without health insurance during a global pandemic that's hitting this country in many ways the hardest, at least for now. There are also massive implementation issues here in Florida. It's been extremely difficult for individuals to get unemployment insurance benefits. In Tennessee, they failed to get food assistance to kids in school districts whose families didn't qualify for SNAP. So I mentioned the pandemic EBT. It was SNAP families plus other families in those schools. Tennessee didn't do that second population. So there are thousands of Tennessee families that aren't getting food assistance that should under federal law. And then also they've empowered and emboldened governors to deny or refuse federal aid. So South Dakota, basically the governor just said, we're not going to get that additional federal aid for unemployment insurance. And this week, there are reports that the Nebraska governor is just refusing to do these emergency food stamp allotments. The third story is that this is a deepening crisis and the glass is not empty or full, it's just broken or shattered. My co-authors, when we were working on this paper, I said, there's no way the Senate's going to go into recess in August and not pass another bill. But that's exactly what they did. And it looks like there's going to be no other congressional legislation, congressional action through the election. As a result, state governments, local governments, and most importantly, communities are in free fall. And I had a really tough time picking which chart or table to use for this point, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the reach of the pandemic crisis, at least as it relates to poverty and inequality, is wide, but the depth of the crisis is uneven and unevenly felt. So all of this information that we're getting from the Census Bureau's weekly household surveys suggests that children of color, people of color are experiencing tons of housing insecurity and tons of food insecurity. So what does the American welfare state's response to COVID tell us about the future crisis? I think it tells us 5 things. First, there's more of an appetite for and less resistance to cash benefits than people realize. This might be heartening to people that are focused on UBI. Second, though, Congress is going to use existing programs to deliver assistance. And third, Congress is heavily reliant on intermediaries. So the federal response is only going to be good as the state delivery and the state implementation. And relatedly, PLACE does a lot of work for race and racism in the United States. And so the government response is going to exacerbate geographic inequalities, and especially groups that have been excluded from welfare programs. And then the other thing related to the congressional inaction is don't assume that the federal government can offer a sustained response to a crisis that lasts several months. You know, you basically got 2 bills through Congress to work on these issues, and yet the crisis continues, and it looks like there's going to be no other action from Washington. So what does this mean? For the climate crisis, it's made me much, much more pessimistic about the government's ability to help individuals meet basic needs during the climate crisis. So I would have thought that the science of the pandemic, right, the fact that most Americans, if you've lived long enough, have gotten sick, have loved ones, lost loved ones from illnesses, you would think that the pandemic is just a crisis that individuals can understand. Not true from our current experience, but compared to the science of climate change, it seems far more scrutable.
Time.
Okay, I'll just wrap up. The geography, I think, is also quite different. You know, in many ways, the pandemic has been a block to migration. We're going to see a lot more internal displacement, internal migration, and pressures on global migration from the climate crisis. And then the timeline of both crises is quite different as well, that we've got a permanent and intensifying crisis. So I have the EPA's air quality map of the West Coast from just Tuesday, and then on the right, a picture of Lake Charles after the most recent Hurricane Laura. So, and I'll just end by pointing out that Black Americans on the micro level are routinely discriminated against in welfare programs, and in states with large Black populations, especially in the Southeast, you see, you know, a reluctance for Medicaid expansion. As I've written before, immigrants are really, since the 90s, have been written out of a lot of these programs. And then you also exclude Americans in the territories and Indigenous Americans as well. And I just leave you with this picture from Hurricane Maria's devastation of Puerto Rico. So I'm really interested in any questions or comments or criticisms that you all have. And I would be grateful to continue the conversation over email as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'd like to thank all of the panels at this point. Excellent presentations. Now we're at 4 o'clock, and so I think those folks who need to go should probably go. Can our panelists stay around for a couple of more minutes? There are a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
Sure. So why don't we give ourselves 10 minutes so that we're finished at 4:10, and we'll move for them. But so let me say my thank yous now. This has been really interesting. Lucy, you had a question. Why don't we start with you? And then we'll move second to Harold McDonald. He also had some comments.
Yeah, so my question was in the chat, but I'm wondering, you know, right to education, right to healthcare, we don't have those in this country. Do we need to have those rights to move forward, or can we actually go back to, you know, that better time in the 1970s where we had busing, we didn't have neoliberalism taking so much hold. Can we do that through a culture change, or do we need to have those rights enacted, at least like other countries have?
So I'm happy to answer from the education perspective, right? I think rights are always good. In many states, there are education is a fundamental right in the state constitution, but you still see these wide disparities because the rights are only as good as the enforcement. So I think we need rights combined with the culture change, particularly in education. I mean, one of the hard parts about the intrusion of neoliberalism into public education is it's coincided with desegregation of schools. So I'm not sure that you can disaggregate those two phenomenon. So I have a new article coming out called Monopolizing Whiteness, where I argue that we should really think about the ways in which white students are monopolizing high quality education, and argued for using some antitrust frameworks in order to articulate and understand how to remedy the harm. So I think step one for me is starting to reconceptualize the way we think and talk about public education. And that goes to culture change. The other thing is that you also need legal incentives in order to push us in the right direction. Things I've written about in the past that I would argue for, in addition to any kind of rights, or instead of the autonomy given to local districts that I talked about, we need more regional systems of delivering public education. And we generally need to rethink about the goals of public education and why we're doing it in the first place.
Yeah, so I'll answer along similar lines, I think, from health. I think rights are important, but I just gave a talk. Chile is having a constitutional process on developing a new constitution post-dictatorship, in which the right to health is the most sought after right to be in the new constitution. And Chile is an incredibly neoliberal state. And we need experience shows from countries that have transformative constitutions, that have social constitutions, that you need more than just grafting rights, social rights on. You need to pay attention to the architecture of the system, the education system, as Erica said, and in our case, the health system, which is often treated as this like technical apparatus that is not permeated by all kinds of norm commitments and values, and the political economy that shapes the social determinants of health that we've heard over and over again. So I do think rights, but the way rights function in reality has a lot to do with these other kinds of law.
Thank you. Harold McDougall, you had a question? Oh, you had more of a comment. Do you want to join us? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good, okay. Well, so you kind of know my perspective. My perspective is always grassroots up. I think that when we start talking about regional work, it seems to me that the larger the system that we're operating in, federal, regional, whatever it is, the larger the system we're operating in, the less power, the less say ordinary people have, regular folks. There's a model that comes out of my own law school, Howard Law, in terms of where I'm teaching, that's like, you go to the Supreme Court and you wave a magic wand and all these great things happen. But the Republican Party over the last 40 years has been engaged in a project to make all federal courts as conservative as possible. So at the very least, you start moving into state courts, and then, like Kathleen Morris and Heather Gerken at Yale have this affirmative litigation project at the municipal level, where they are making some progress. But even that has to be paired with, strong grassroots organizing. I saw a kind of a meme or something on Facebook the other day that was like, basically saying that everybody who's all victims of oppression under this system need to organize their own Me Too movement. It was a black kid who had a kind of a poster that he was holding on his lap, and he's just saying, well, George, Floyd died from a knee on his neck, but the cops aren't the only people who are doing this to black folks. I mean, teachers are doing it, social workers are doing it. So I think there's a real need for kind of a grassroots awareness of the things that we're talking about right now, in terms that only we can really understand, in order to build a constituency to make the kinds of things that we want to happen actually happen. Now I can't hear you. You muted yourself, Athena.
I'm sorry.
There we go.
We will get better at this, okay? We'll just have to keep doing it on these panel discussions. Harold, I think that's probably a good place to end, unless one of our panelists has a comment to make on the issues that you've raised. Open the floor to them. Any last words?
I would say one thing that I don't want to be the last word, but I noticed that I'm somewhat more optimistic than some of the other panelists. And I think that's one, from having a comparative perspective. Like, other countries do this a whole hell of a lot better than we do, and it is possible. And the historic perspective, like, it is not inevitable that we ended up the way we are. So I do want us to hold on to this window of transformative possibility, because if we just give up, then yeah, as Harold said, you know, all four movements and the Justice is Global that's being launched today.
Thank you. Other comments from panelists?
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and I think it was a great panel, and the folks who attended it, most of them are still here, so thank you all. This was a terrific way to start, I think, our series of workshops.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for organizing it.
It's great that it was short.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
This was wonderful. And we'll be in touch. We'll follow up with some information.
Okay, bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.